Hello, and welcome back to the History of the Mongols. I'm your host, Kyle. In the last few episodes, we have followed the rise of Ögedei as Great Khan in 1229 and the remarkable military campaigns that expanded Mongol power across Asia and into Europe. We covered the destruction of the Jurchen Jin dynasty in northern China, the subjugation of Central Asia and Iran, the sweeping invasions through the Caucasus and Anatolia, and the legendary Great Western Campaign, led by Subutai and Batu, that brought Mongol forces into Eastern Europe, defeating the Cumans, the Rus principalities, and ultimately achieving victories in Hungary and Poland. In this episode, we will shift our focus to the later years of Ögedei's reign and his death at the end of 1241, a pivotal moment that sowed the seeds for future turmoil within the Mongol Empire. When we last discussed Ögedei, he was at the height of his power. We explored his role in building the imperial administration, implementing taxation systems, constructing the Mongol capital at Karakorum, and commissioning new military campaigns. The detailed defeat of the Jin dynasty in 1234, the culmination of decades of conflict with a powerful enemy who had long resisted the Mongol advance. Their downfall was undoubtedly a source of immense pride for Ögedei, symbolising the might of his empire. Although he often delegated military leadership to capable generals, Ögedei took an active and hands-on approach to governance during the early 1230s. Skilled advisors such as Yelu Chukai in northern China, Mahmud Yalavach in Central Asia, and Qinkai as chancellor led reconstruction efforts and administrative reforms in newly conquered territories. Under Ögedei's authority, few rulers in history could rival the scale of his influence, territorial reach, or accumulated wealth. However, the latter years of Ögedei's reign were overshadowed by personal loss and declining health. The death of his brother Tolui in 1232, either from excessive alcoholism or, as some like to speculate, self-sacrifice during a ritual to save Ögedei from a deadly illness, dealt him a profound emotional blow. Tolui had been both his closest confidant and a powerful political ally. The loss of his son and designated heir, Ko-Chu, during the opening stages of the Mongol-Song conflict in 1236, a war launched shortly after the destruction of the Jin, was another devastating setback. Grief-stricken and disillusioned, Ögedei gradually withdrew from the day-to-day affairs of governance. He increasingly turned to excessive drinking and feasting as a means of escape, and his health rapidly deteriorated. By the mid-1230s, as the Great Western Campaign was underway, it is likely that Ögedei was already physically incapable of leading armies or effectively managing state affairs. With his judgment clouded by alcohol and growing disinterest in governance, Ögedei became increasingly vulnerable to manipulation by opportunistic officials, and his wife, Törégene. Her ambitions, motivated by personal enrichment and political power, often undermined the empire's efforts to stabilise and rebuild its newly acquired territories. Yelu Chukai, the Khitan statesman who championed responsible governance in China under Mongol rule, experienced both the promise and frustrations of his position acutely. You may recall that Chukai had successfully convinced Ögedei Khan to abandon proposals to depopulate northern China and instead adopt a structured taxation system that would curtail the rampant exploitation by corrupt Mongol officers. In the early 1230s, Chukai's influence peaked. With Ögedei's support, he implemented sweeping reforms to stabilise governance and alleviate the burdens on the local population. In 1231, Chukai was appointed head of the Secretariat for North China, placing him in charge of civilian administration for the entire region. Following the final collapse of the Jin dynasty in 1234, and with Mongol authority firmly established across northern China, Chukai persuaded Ögedei to conduct a comprehensive census. The task was entrusted to Shigi Kutuk, Ögedei's adopted brother, and aimed to encourage displaced populations to return home and to create a more equitable system of taxation. Chukai succeeded in introducing a household tax, which replaced the more arbitrary and often crippling individual levies the Mongols had imposed elsewhere, such as in Central Asia. Grain taxes were also adjusted, now calculated based on the size and productivity of each family's land, rather than applied as a flat, uniform rate. These reforms dramatically reduced the tax burden on many ordinary households. By 1235, Chukai appeared to be at the height of his influence. Tax revenues reflected the early success of his policies. In 1230, only 10,000 ingots of silver had been collected from North China, but by 1234, revenue targets had more than doubled to 22,000 ingots. Chukai had even begun efforts to integrate former Jin officials into the Mongol bureaucracy, signalling his broader ambitions to stabilize and rebuild the region under Mongol rule. However, 1236 marked the beginning of a sharp downturn for Chukai's reforms, for the region, and for the Mongol administration's broader aspirations. The completion of the census, undertaken at Chukai's urging to establish an orderly tax system, revealed troubling data. According to Mongol figures, northern China contained just 1.73 million households across 10 administrative districts, approximately 8.5 million individuals. To grasp the scale of this decline, consider that the Jin dynasty's final census in 1207 had counted 8.4 million households, totaling roughly 53.5 million people. While there is no doubt that the preceding decades of warfare under the Mongol-Jin conflict had caused staggering loss of life, the true extent of population decline is difficult to determine. Much of the apparent collapse can be attributed to displacement and migration. Vast numbers of refugees fled to Song dynasty territory in southern China, while many others became part of a floating population, people without stable homes, living in temporary camps or concealed in forests and mountains. Moreover, the census itself likely suffered from significant flaws. Fearful of the Mongols or suspecting that the census heralded higher taxes, many families fled before officials arrived. Others simply could not be counted because their homes had been destroyed or their communities obliterated. Yet, even with these caveats, the evidence leaves little room for doubt. Northern China suffered devastating population losses during the 2 decades of Mongol conquest. For those not killed outright by the wars, other consequences proved equally lethal. The destruction of farmland led to widespread famine. Disease spread unchecked in the chaotic aftermath. And banditry, fueled by social collapse, took its toll on both the vulnerable and the displaced. Whatever Yelu Chukai's original intentions for the census may have been, Ögedei Khan quickly redirected its purpose. With the new data in hand, Ögedei carved up vast tracts of northern China into princely appanages known as kubi, distributing them among 3rd and 4th generation descendants of Genghis Khan and favoured military officers. As the Mongol Empire was regarded as the collective inheritance of the Genghisid family, it was expected that all of them, and by this point there were many, would be provided for. To support their incomes, these appanages included not only agricultural lands, but also the Chinese families living on them. Among the beneficiaries were Tolui's widow, Surghagtani Beki, and her young son, the 20-year-old Kublai, who received his first official post over Chinese territory. Though like many other Mongols, Kublai governed these lands in name only, residing instead in Mongolia. Yelu Chukai was deeply disturbed by this development. His broader vision had been to centralize governance and implement uniform administration across North China. Instead, Ögedei's decision marked a dramatic step toward decentralization, introducing new layers of princely egos and military officials through which the Chinese population could be further exploited. Although Chukai managed to secure Ögedei's agreement that taxation, in these appanages, would remain under central government control, enforcing this in practice proved nearly impossible. The years that followed only deepened Chukai's frustrations. At court, he faced determined opposition from those who sought to extract China's wealth for personal gain. Though Chukai maintained a cordial personal relationship with Ögedei, the death of the Khan's son and heir, Kochu, in late 1236 drained Ögedei's remaining enthusiasm for governance. By 1237, Chukai's rivals grew bold enough to publicly accuse him of misappropriating funds, a charge that ultimately led nowhere, but signalled the beginning of an enduring struggle for influence. Chukai did manage to convince Ögedei to permit civil service examinations in China to recruit local bureaucrats. Yet, of the 4,000 candidates who passed the exams in 1238, few were ever appointed to actual positions. The Mongol elite remained reluctant to cede administrative authority to the Chinese population. As a Khitan, seen by the Mongols as a distant relative, Chukai was tolerated despite his adoption of Chinese customs and values. His reputation for loyal service to both Genghis Khan and Ögedei shielded him for a time. But as Ögedei succumbed increasingly to heavy drinking and disengagement, Chukai lost the political backing necessary to resist those bent on exploiting China. Meanwhile, Mongol demands for ever-increasing tax revenues undermined Chukai's reform efforts. Central Asian Muslim merchants, long favoured by the imperial family for their role as traders, financiers, and informants during Western campaigns, became key players in extracting wealth from China. Ögedei's notorious habit of overpaying these merchants strained the treasury. To put this in perspective, recall that the total annual tax revenue from North China in 1230 was around 10,000 silver ingots. Yet, on multiple occasions, Ögedei personally gifted 500 silver or gold ingots to individual merchants. These lavish overpayments served several purposes. They helped to revive overland trade networks devastated by warfare, incentivized merchants to brave the difficult journey to Karakorum, and projected the immense wealth and authority of the great Khan, for who but the most powerful ruler under heaven could afford such extravagance? This close financial partnership between Mongol princes and Muslim merchants became so common it earned a specific term in Mongolian, ortog. Through these arrangements, Mongol aristocrats, including Ögedei himself, extended vast loans of silver to favoured merchants. The consequence, however, was a considerable drain on the imperial treasury, enriching both the princes and the merchant class at the expense of the broader empire. By late 1239, Ögedei Khan was persuaded to transfer control of tax collection in northern China to private tax farmers, a decision that proved disastrous. At the centre of this system was a notorious figure named al-Rahman. Under this arrangement, groups of Central Asian merchants bid for the right to collect different types of taxes. To win these contracts, they promised to deliver the Mongols a significantly higher tax quota than before. Any revenue they collected beyond the promised amount was theirs to keep as profit, and they collected as much as possible. The same merchants who imposed these crushing tax burdens then lent money to the impoverished Chinese at exorbitant interest rates. Ironically, the silver they used for these loans often originated from Mongol treasury funds that had been taken from Chinese tax revenue in the first place. Despite Yelu Chukai's objections, this system was implemented not only in China, but also in Central Asia, with devastating consequences. In 1234, the total tax revenue from northern China amounted to 22,000 silver ingots. By 1240, under the tax farmers, the official tax burden had doubled to 44,000 silver ingots, a figure that does not account for the merchants' hidden profits or the crushing interest on loans. The population suffered enormously. Families were forced to sell their land, homes, livestock, and even relatives to meet the tax demands. Many fled their homes entirely to escape the oppression. In a belated gesture of damage control, Ögedei issued a decree capping loan interest so that it could not exceed the original borrowed amount, a token reform that came far too late. Even after al-Rahman was removed from office in late 1241, the damage had been done. Northern China, still reeling from the destruction of the Mongol conquest, was left economically crippled. To address the chaos, Ögedei ordered public funds to cover the unpaid debts, a staggering sum totalling 76,000 silver ingots. Of course, this meant the merchants, including al-Rahman, still walked away wealthy, their profits untouched. In the aftermath, Ögedei appointed Mahmud Yalavach, head of the Secretariat for Central Asia, to oversee northern China's administration and restore a functional tax system. Unfortunately, Yalavach barely had time to act. Ögedei died just 1 month later. While his administration descended into corruption and exploitation, Ögedei himself descended into alcoholism. It is hard to overstate his detachment from governance in his final years. Instead of ruling, he spent his days drinking, feasting, and hunting. Even during official deliberations, he was often thoroughly drunk. Virtually all medieval sources, even those otherwise praising his reign, remark on Ögedei's severe dependence on alcohol. The famously reserved secret history of the Mongols makes particular note of his inability to resist drink. Yelu Chukai once attempted to confront the issue, pointing out how wine had corroded the metal rim of its container and warning, "If it harms metal so easily, how much more will it harm the 5 human organs?" Ögedei laughed, rewarded Chukai with gold and silk, and promptly ordered more wine. The most well-known anecdote comes from Ögedei's older brother, Chagatai. Frustrated by Ögedei's drunkenness, Chagatai ordered his cupbearers to cut the number of cups he was served each day. In response, Ögedei simply doubled the size of the cups. Increasingly ill and perpetually intoxicated, Ögedei neglected his imperial responsibilities. In his absence, his wife Törégene quietly expanded her political influence, setting the stage for further power struggles after his death. Törégene was captured by the Mongols in 1204 or 1205, previously the wife of a Merkit chief, before being given in marriage to Ögedei. Although she was neither Ögedei's first wife nor his favourite, those positions belonged to Borachin and Möga Khatun, respectively, the latter having been a wife of Genghis Khan himself. Törégene held the distinction of being the only wife to bear Ögedei's sons. Of his 7 children, 5 were born to Törégene, and the remaining 2 by concubines. Several of her sons have already featured in our previous episodes. The eldest, Güyük, followed by Köthen, and Kötü, who had been chosen as heir but tragically died in 1236. The death of Kötü was both a personal and political blow from which Ögedei never recovered. In the political vacuum created by Ögedei's deteriorating health and alcoholism, Törégene stepped into the power struggle. Törégene, an astute and ambitious woman, was determined to secure her eldest son, Güyük's succession, and prevent the throne from passing to a rival branch of the Genghis family. Alongside her close confidant, Fatima, a Central Asian Muslim woman captured during the Khwarezmian campaign, Törégene began positioning her allies within key posts of the empire. Contemporary and near-contemporary sources universally recognise Törégene's intelligence, but many also describe her as vengeful, calculating, and politically ruthless. Even during Ögedei's lifetime, Törégene began issuing edicts in his name, filling the void left by the Great Khan's incapacity or unwillingness to govern. One of her allies was the infamous al-Rahman, the tax farmer from China, introduced to her by Fatima. Though Ögedei had dismissed al-Rahman from office for his exploitative practices, Törégene's protection allowed him to remain influential at court. In fact, al-Rahman became one of Ögedei's drinking companions, plying the Great Khan with alcohol as others who had tried to curb his excesses faded from influence. Chinkai, chief minister of the Central Secretariat, had been sidelined by al-Rahman and Törégene. Ögedei's brother Chagatai remained in Central Asia, and Yelu Chukai, once a key advisor, had been reduced to the relatively powerless role of court astrologer. On December 7, 1241, Ögedei embarked on a hunting trip in Mongolia. He returned 3 days later to attend a feast, joined by al-Rahman and Ögedei's sister, al-Altun, queen of the Uyghurs, likely present to protest increasing Mongol encroachments on her territory. Throughout the night, al-Rahman poured Ögedei wine after wine. By the morning of December 11th, 1241, Ögedei, Great Khan of the Mongol Empire, was dead at the age of 55. Rumours of foul play quickly circulated. Ibaka of the Kerayit, a former wife of Genghis Khan and cupbearer at the final feast, was accused of poisoning the Great Khan. However, she was exonerated by the respected General Ögedei, a known loyalist to Ögedei. Initially, it appeared that Möga Khatun, the highly respected widow of both Genghis and Ögedei, would assume the regency until a successor could be chosen. Yet, Törégene, who had long prepared for this moment, quickly outmaneuvered her rivals. Messengers were dispatched to Chagatai, now the only surviving son of Genghis Khan. Chagatai sided with Törégene, supporting her bid for the regency. Conveniently for Törégene, both Chagatai and Möga Khatun died shortly thereafter. While speculation regarding these timely deaths lingers, no conclusive evidence links them to Törégene. Regardless, Törégene initially enjoyed broad support as regent, with her primary objective being to secure the imperial succession for her son, Güyük. Achieving this, however, would prove anything but simple or inexpensive. Early in her regency, Temuge, the youngest brother of Genghis Khan and his only surviving full sibling, attempted to seize the capital, Karakorum, with military force. Törégene's political acumen, coupled with the timely arrival of Ögedei's son Melik and his troops, thwarted Temuge's ambitions. Through a combination of diplomacy and force, Törégene consolidated her position, but the question of the empire's succession remained far from settled. The issue of succession was something the Mongols never fully resolved. While Genghis Khan had declared his third son, Ögedei, as his heir, this was not entirely consistent with traditional steppe practices, where neither a designated heir nor strict primogeniture were universally followed or accepted. In principle, the election of a new Khan was open to all legitimate male descendants of Genghis Khan through his chief wife Berta. However, the uncertain paternity of his eldest son, Jochi, meant that Jochi's descendants were often excluded from serious consideration. Genghis Khan's authority during his lifetime was absolute, which allowed him to declare Ögedei his heir. But after Ögedei's death, his descendants did not wield the same uncontested power. Sources disagree on whether Genghis Khan intended the throne to pass permanently through Ögedei's lineage, or whether the imperial throne was to be awarded to whichever candidate from among the family branches could secure enough support. In steppe political culture, military strength, seniority, and backing from influential commanders were as important, if not more so, than bloodline alone. The Khan was chosen at a Quriltai, a council of the empire's elite. In earlier steppe empires, it was not uncommon for succession to pass laterally, from brother to brother, before it moved to the next generation. Before his death, Ögedei had named his grandson Shiramun, the son of his late heir, Kochu, as his successor. But Shiramun, young and inexperienced, lacked the military and political support necessary to make his claim viable. Meanwhile, Töregene's second son, Kutan, put himself forward as a contender for the throne, drawing upon rumours that Genghis Khan had once spoken favourably of him. Unlike Shiramun, Kutan had both military experience and a loyal following, making him a serious candidate. Töregene's initial attempts to organise a Quriltai to settle the succession were frustrated by Batu, head of Jochi's lineage. Batu, citing gout and poor health, refused to attend or even send representatives. His opposition stemmed not only from his own ambitions, but also from his antagonistic relationship with Güyük, Töregene's eldest son. Their hostility had developed during the Great Western Campaign, and Batu saw Güyük's potential ascension as a direct threat to his own authority. While Töregene sought to arrange the succession, she did not act as a passive caretaker of the empire. Instead, she made sweeping administrative decisions to consolidate her power. Many of the so-called progressives in the Mongol administration, those advocating for reconstruction and regulated taxation, were removed from office. This included Qinkai in the Central Secretariat, Mahmud Yalavach in North China, Yalavach's son Mas'ud Beg in Central Asia, and Kyrgyz in Iran. Kyrgyz's dismissal proved fatal. He was executed by the Chagatayids on a minor charge, enraging the Jochid branch with whom he was associated. Mas'ud Beg fled to Batu's court, finding refuge among the Jochids. His father, Mahmud Yalavach, had already clashed with Chagatai before Ögedei's death, and his removal from office in China pleased the Chagatayid faction. Qinkai and Mahmud Yalavach eventually found protection under Kutan, Töregene's second son, who refused to surrender them to his mother. Their experience and influence bolstered Kutan's candidacy. Yelu Chukai, once a major figure in the administration, had already seen his influence wane before these events. Reduced to the role of court astrologer, he was spared further humiliation, but remained politically irrelevant. After the death of his wife, Chukai passed away in 1243, isolated and disillusioned by the collapse of his reformist efforts. Meanwhile, Töregene's ally, al-Rahman, was reinstated as head of administration in North China. While little is recorded about his second tenure, it is likely that his exploitative practices resumed unchecked. Part of Töregene's strategy in removing the so-called progressives from office was to win the favour of the Mongol aristocracy, many of whom were eager to exploit the resources of China. A growing number of Mongol elites were uncomfortable with the significant influence wielded by non-Mongols, particularly Chinese administrators, in the empire's government. By purging these figures, Töregene positioned herself as a champion of Mongol interests and strengthened support for her son, Güyük's claim to the throne. She further secured loyalty through an extensive campaign of gift-giving, distributing lavish presents to key members of the elite to ensure their backing. It is telling of the scale of Mongol expansion that, even during this period of political manoeuvring, military campaigns continued across vast distances. Yet by Mongol standards, it was considered a lull in activity. Baiju remained engaged in operations against the Seljuk Turks in Anatolia, and minor campaigns persisted along the Song dynasty's borders in China. That such simultaneous wars could be dismissed as routine demonstrates the sheer reach and military capacity of the Mongol Empire. It was not until the summer of 1246 that Törégene believed she had consolidated enough support to convene a new Quriltai to decide the empire's next great Khan. The primary contenders were her sons, Güyük and Köthen, as well as Shiraman, the young grandson of Ögedei. However, neither Köthen nor Shiraman could match the influence, political preparation, or financial resources Törégene had amassed on Güyük's behalf. Batu once again refused to attend the assembly, though this time he did send representatives, his older brother Orda and younger brother Berke, perhaps recognising that continued obstructionism risked further instability within the empire. The Quriltai was held near the Kyrlen River in Mongolia in August 1246. Törégene spared no expense in orchestrating the event. A massive white tent, capable of housing 2,000 attendees, served as the grand venue for the proceedings. There, the empire's nobility engaged in days of deliberation over the future of the Mongol state. In typical Mongol fashion, these discussions were accompanied by extravagant displays of hospitality, all funded by Törégene. Each day the attendees were provided with coordinated ceremonial attire, white velvet robes on the first day, followed by red and blue on subsequent days, and brocade garments on the fourth. Mornings were dedicated to political debate, afternoons to drinking, and evenings to feasting, the opulence of these festivities underscoring Törégene's determination to secure her son's elevation. Ultimately, the nobility deemed Shiraman too young to rule, and Köthen in poor health, leaving Güyük as the consensus choice. In accordance with tradition, Güyük initially refused the honour several times before finally accepting. He was ceremoniously lifted onto the throne by his cousins, Orda, son of Jochi, and Yesu Munka, son of Chagatai. On August 24, 1246, Güyük, son of Ögedei and grandson of Genghis Khan, was proclaimed the third great Khan of the Mongol Empire. Our next episode discusses the not-so-long reign of Güyük Khan. Though his time in power was brief, his reign represents a fascinating and turbulent period in Mongol history, marked by internal power struggles, diplomatic intrigue, and the simmering tensions that had long been brewing within the empire's vast aristocracy. I hope you have enjoyed this episode of the History of the Mongols. If you like the content and want to continue to support the series, you could like the video, make sure you are subscribed to the YouTube channel, and leave a comment to let me know where in the world you are listening from. Thank you, and see you all next time.